I've reviewed it with my client, Your Honor, and we would enter a plea of not guilty.
An estranged husband stands before a judge on Valentine's Day, accused of paying off two men to kill his estranged wife's lover.
We believe the evidence at trial will show that this was not a random act of violence, but rather this was a calculated and cold-hearted murder for hire scheme based on a personal grievance.
Police say this angry love triangle turned deadly over a messy divorce, and the alleged price for murder? Prosecutors say this man paid $10,000 to two men to do it. For Law and Crime, I'm Chris Stewart. We have an update on this love triangle story that we've been following out of Illinois here on Law and Crime. Many people in tiny Madison County, Illinois, not far from St. Louis, are mourning the life of Portia Rowland, who's the person you see right here. Before I get into the latest developments from the courtroom and how Rowland became the alleged target of a scorned and jealous ex, let's get you caught up on what police say happened on the morning of January 21st. Police say the victim, Portia Rowland, was shot 4 times as she left her house to start her car.
Upon activation, these investigators arrived on Tuesday morning. They had very few leads to work with. Through their hard work, their determination, they were able to take what information they had and turn this into very substantial leads. Those leads were able to quickly identify a suspect vehicle, which was tracked to an address and a location in Missouri.
In this news conference, authorities said that by tracking the suspected vehicle, they were able to arrest this man as a suspect. His name is Marty Shaw. The prosecutor actually mentioned that license plate readers led them to Shaw.
If anyone doubts the effectiveness of license plate readers in our communities, I would use this case as a case in point of how effective they can be.
Now, when we talk about license plate readers, they can be a controversial topic. Some groups like the ACLU have criticized them because they're concerned that they could be used for mass surveillance and violate people's rights. But in this situation, police say it's what allowed them to crack this case. Police say after arresting Shaw, they arrested Gary Johnson on an unrelated felony, but eventually determined he was allegedly involved. They say Johnson was the shooter and Shaw was behind the wheel of the getaway car. But the arrests of Shaw and Johnson are really just the beginning of this story, because police say allegedly there was someone who was pulling the strings of this plan to murder. That person, according to police, is Sammy Schaefer, and that's really where we start connecting dots in this case. At a pretrial hearing, prosecutors say that Schaefer was going through what they described as a contentious divorce, and Schaefer was jealous of Rowland, who began dating his now estranged wife. KSDK TV out of St. Louis reports that Schaefer did make threats to Rowland in the weeks leading up to her murder. He allegedly sent her messages saying things like, quote, "I wish you would let go of her and let my family heal together again for my sons." Then the next day, he allegedly sent another message. This one read, quote, "God made us to be with a man and a woman, not man, man, or woman, woman. But I'm not getting into that conversation. But you're not a parent and you don't know what it feels like to see if your kids go through something. Just because you did, don't mean my boys have to. They deserve more, and if you'd stay out of this and move on, it would be better." Detectives say they've also spoken with Schaefer's now estranged wife, who claims that she was growing concerned that Schaefer had been tracking her with GPS devices. Now, how did Schaefer get in touch with the two men that he allegedly hired to kill his estranged wife's girlfriend? Attorneys say Schaefer paid Johnson and Shaw $10,000 and left the money inside excavation equipment at his home for them to pick up. In the pretrial hearing, Schaefer's defense argued that it's unfair to trust the narrative that we just laid out for you, which is what prosecutors are saying, because they say the majority of the story is coming from Shaw, who's the man that Schaefer allegedly hired for the murder and is facing murder charges himself. So that could be a major strategy for the defense if this does go to trial. Now, even though the defense tried to get the judge to release Schaefer ahead of trial, the judge sided with the prosecution and Schaefer will remain behind bars. Then on Friday, we had the latest court hearing for Schaefer to enter a plea to these charges: 2 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of solicitation murder for hire. Here is Schaefer's hearing on Friday, which, by the way, was on Valentine's Day.
Good morning, Mr. Schaefer. I'm going to have you stand approximately where that X is, okay? You ready? Cause called is People of the State of Illinois versus Sammy J. Schaefer Jr. Case number 25 CF 213. Mr. Schaefer is present in open court with his attorney, T.J. Mathis. The state is present by Lauren Miracle. The matter comes before this court for arraignment pursuant to an indictment that was returned by the Madison County Grand Jury on February 6 of 2025. All right, you are Sammy J. Schaefer Jr.? You got to answer out loud, sir.
Yes,
How old are you?
36.
How far did you go in school?
Graduated high school.
So you read, write, and understand English. Got to answer out loud.
Oh, yes,
All right. Are you under the influence of any drugs or alcohol as you stand before me today?
just anxiety medicine.
Does that keep you from understanding what we're doing here today?
No.
Mr. Mathis, have you received a copy of the indictment in this case?
Yes, Your Honor. And I've reviewed it with my client, Your Honor, and we would enter a plea of not guilty.
You waive the reading of the indictment?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, so a plea of not guilty will be entered as to each count charged in the indictment. The matter is set for the jury trial docket on March 3rd, 2025 at 9 a.m. Trial counsel for the defense.
T.J. Mathis and Scott Rosenblum, Your Honor.
All right, trial counsel for the state. The case is assigned to myself for trial and disposition. Anything further, counselor?
No, Your Honor.
From the state?
No, thank you, Your Honor.
All right, that'll conclude this matter.
So not guilty is the plea. And there is so much to digest in this story, but at the end of the day, it's an incredibly sad story and a tragic story. And we looked up Portia Rowland's Facebook page, and you can see that it is now listed as a tribute page, so people can go through and leave messages for her. And you can see in these posts that she was someone who people really cared about and loved. And we saw there were also people understandably angry that someone would lose their life allegedly over jealousy and a messy divorce. Again, there's a lot to digest in this story. It's really just getting started, and we're going to look at it from not just how this could play out in court, but also how this investigation went down. Joining us now to talk about this investigation is Detective Eric Barnes. Thanks for taking the time to be here, Detective. What stands out to you? You have this love triangle, this murder for hire plot, allegedly, and ultimately here's this estranged husband who's behind bars.
You know, it seems that the domestic relationships that lead to these murder for hires, you know, it's always the first person that you typically look at in these situations, you know, because they are emotionally connected, and sometimes people have a hard time letting go.
Yeah, because how often do you see murder for hire plots? They always get headlines, but it seems like over and over and over again, it is something that comes up.
Yes, you know, in the scale of typical murder or homicide investigations, you know, murder for hire is pretty rare. But the murder for hires that involve love triangles or people being emotionally involved and they're unable to sever ties, you can see is pretty common in murder for hires that relationships play a key role in these.
Because, I mean, clearly you would never want to hire someone to kill anyone, but to think allegedly that he would have thought that he was going to get away with this. How common in these cases do the suspects typically think that they might be able to actually get away with murder?
You know, I think that it's a two-pronged approach to murder for hire. You have your actual actor, your planner, and you have the people that they hire to carry it out. And typically the person that is planning and attempting to hire someone, they're so emotionally involved that, you know, they're unable to see outside their emotions. So they make a lot of mistakes. And then you have your actors that actually carry out the murder for hire. Typically, you know, their motivation for being involved is going to be financial. So you have people acting for two different reasons. And when they're not in sync 100%, they make mistakes.
And I know since we've been following this story, just one thing that we keep coming back to is just the dollar amount on this. And of course, there's never an amount of money that would ever warrant killing somebody. But and $10,000, what stands out to you with that dollar amount?
Well, $10,000 is not a lot of money in today's world, especially when you look at it. It's not even enough to cover a retainer for a case like this. So right. Then you have two actors, so they would have to split, assuming the $10,000. So what each person is left with is $5,000. And when you look at the amount of time that they're going to lose behind bars and spending time with their loved ones, it really amounts to, a few cents a day.
How typically are these murder for hire plots uncovered? Because in this case, you have the arrest of the getaway man, allegedly, and the person who allegedly fired the rounds to kill Portia Rowland. How does it get to the point where you actually figure out that there was someone who was pulling the strings behind this?
Well, that's a good question. More times than not, you actually may know who your shooter is or may know who the mastermind is, but getting there requires a certain level of cooperation from the person that you make an arrest on. Typically, the first person that you contact and arrest in these cases are going to be your shooter, because you're working from your crime scene back to the person that was actually there committing it. And typically, your mastermind is not going to be present at the crime scene, because they're doing everything they can to kind of insulate themselves from that, because they know they're going to be the first person accused.
And based off what we've been seeing in court, the defense seems to believe that the person who pointed the finger at their client was Marty Shaw, who was allegedly the getaway driver in this, a person who was paid by the suspect to kill his estranged wife's lover, according to police. What do you make of the fact that the person who might have given up the suspect in this case was the person who was paid, allegedly, to commit this murder?
Well, the cookie always crumbles when you apply enough pressure. And the getaway driver, when you look at the level of criminal culpability, your mastermind, he put the plan in place. Your shooter is the actual person that actually made the murder happen. And the getaway driver, although he's guilty and was a vital role in, carrying out this murder, he has a less criminal culpability because he was just a driver. So as a law enforcement tactic, that's the first person that we want to speak to try to minimize his role in the murder.
And the defense appears to be, they were at least trying in some of the pretrial hearings to poke holes in the fact that the person who is accused of being involved in this alleged murder is someone who is pointing the finger at their client. From an investigative standpoint, what do you need to have beyond just the word of someone who is accused of being involved in a murder to actually make it stick in court?
Well, I think when you apply pressure and you have people that are involved in a conspiracy offense, which murder for hire is, you always need cooperation. And so when you have alleged parties from this conspiracy pointing fingers at themselves, that means that you're pushing the right buttons. But what law enforcement often has to have outside of the testimony of someone that was criminally involved in the offense, you have to have factors to kind of corroborate their story. Because at this point, it's every man for themselves, and people are going to tell you what they need to tell you to point the finger at someone else and to get out of the hot seat. So as law enforcement, we have to find things like cell phone records, maybe since there was it's a murder for hire, maybe we look for any cash transactions or any kind of types of payment that may have changed hands, and any details that wouldn't be known to members of the public just from hearing about the story.
What's the moment like for you as an investigator, if you've ever investigated a case like this where you make arrests and it appears you have the people who are responsible for the murder, but then there's that moment of, wait a second, there's way more to this story, and there was actually someone who was paying, allegedly, two people in this case, to kill somebody?
I think as a homicide detective, a great practice is you're never done investigating your case, because there's always more and more facts. And our goal is not to arrest someone or to clear someone, but it's to find the truth. So the search for the truth continues long after you make an arrest, and it continues all the way through the day of trial. And that's what you do. So you work your facts, and wherever your facts lead. And so, in the murder for hire, it's very easy to connect the dots on your person at the crime scene and how they got to the crime scene. But then you unravel the motive and figuring out who was actually behind it.
I want to talk about the way that Marty Shaw was arrested in this, because the authorities were pretty open in their news conference in saying that this case appeared to be cold. You had this woman who was shot 4 times as she was leaving her house in the morning to go to work, and they didn't really know where to turn. But then it was a license plate reader that led them to this getaway car. How important is that tool when it comes to how detectives do their jobs in investigations like this?
I have a saying that I would rather take a great surveillance video or surveillance photo over a witness, because that evidence is hard to dispute. And I think in today's world and the era of law enforcement being publicized on television, the jurors have higher expectations on law enforcement to be able to provide not only witness testimony, but to actually provide technology-based evidence, which would go back again to suggest the surveillance footage or maybe license plate readers to go along with your witness testimony.
And I think of whenever you hear the term hitman, many people who are not in lines of work like you, we probably think of the movies. You think of the smooth guy who will go undetected and never be arrested for crimes. This is what they do for a living, and maybe mob movies, things like that. But typically, what is the reality? What is the profile of someone who is paid to commit murder?
A hitman, in essence, they're hired to commit a murder. So the first element of their job is to make sure that the murder happens. The second part of that is the planning. And the planning is completely on them to figure out how they're going to get away with it and to make sure that they don't get caught. And I think the third element is just the fact of, if I'm ever questioned about it, what do I do? And so if you take your regular everyday civilian that gets involved in these offenses, they never think past getting caught. If I don't get arrested leaving the crime scene, or if I don't get caught at the crime scene and a couple of days go by and I haven't been approached by law enforcement, that maybe, I did enough job to get away.
Sammy Schaefer, the suspect in this case, he has pled not guilty. But when you look at the evidence that is being laid out thus far, how strong of a case does the prosecution have, it appears?
I think that the prosecution in this case has a very strong case in terms that they appear to have all their actors and all of the people that were involved in the offense. You have your getaway driver, you have your shooter, and you have your mastermind. So at this point, they're just rolling out their evidence, figuring out which piece of evidence fits where and which one is going to be the strongest person for them to use to hopefully eventually testify against the mastermind.
I think of the victim in this case, Portia Rowland, who was someone who got into a relationship with this woman who was going through what's been characterized as a very, very messy divorce. Prosecutors have laid out that she received text messages from the suspect, now defendant, that were somewhat threatening in nature, that he didn't approve of the relationship, that the divorce is obviously taking a toll on him. In your experience, what more can be done to protect people who suddenly find themselves embroiled in these kind of love triangle situations that I'm sure when they started the relationship, clearly you never want to get into a situation that can turn violent like it did in this case?
In respect to relationships that people have, you never think that dating someone could actually cause you to lose your life. And I think that is very important, especially with domestic violence situations or just in love triangles, because of the hostility and volatility involved with emotions that may still haven't been put to bed yet. That the only thing that you can do is just look out for yourself. Maybe a cooling off period, maybe what's needed to kind of let things kind of calm down. But, it is very tragic that this young lady lost her life for something that she ultimately had nothing to do with.
Yeah, it's an incredibly sad story. We'll see how this case plays out now that a plea of not guilty has been entered. Detective Eric Barnes, always great to have you here on Law and Crime. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Chris.
Joining us now to talk about where this story could go next is Carla Waymeyer, certified family law specialist. I know you have a lot of experience in some very difficult stories just like this one that involve family dynamics. And unfortunately, this is a case where someone lost their life. What stands out to you just as you've read the details of this case?
Well, unfortunately, what stood out to me right away is just how common these types of situations can be. We've all heard the saying, matters of the heart, right? And breakups can be very, very difficult and emotional for anybody. And as I was reading kind of some of the details, which of course are limited, as is the case with any sort of ongoing legal issue, one of the things that kind of struck a chord with me is that, as is really common with the cases that I handle, we're all human, right? And so a lot of the cases that I handle are charged with a lot of the issues that are kind of woven in this case. You have the issue of divorce and you have the issue of separation, but there's also kind of that underlying criminal issue. And so we saw this gentleman that just, entered a plea. So really interesting to see how this is going to play out.
At this point, how strong does the case appear to be for the prosecution?
Well, I mean, it's difficult to say because I think, we saw that the criminal case is still quite young. It's in early stages, but we were privy to some information. I think the general public is able to know some limited information. At least there was, I guess, some excavation equipment that was discovered at the scene of the crime. I think the police did disclose that there was a glove left behind. So anytime you have physical evidence like that, that's usually some key evidence that will be used at the time of trial. So some of the weaker cases are where you have circumstantial evidence, but here it seems like they do have some physical evidence. So to the extent they'll be able to tie that to the defendant, seems like they may have a stronger case. Now we'll see if there's any DNA evidence, but that's yet to be discovered. We'll see how things play out.
And I know in your experience, you've covered a lot of in the aspects of domestic violence and the impact on families. And I want to get to that in a moment. But I also look at the defense, and they have a job to do here. They're entering a not guilty plea. If you were in the defense attorney's shoes and you look at what we know thus far about this case, what's the approach that you would take if you were defending this client?
Well, I think one of the things, obviously, silence is key. I think that's very, kind of fundamental. And, constitutionally, this gentleman has the right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty. So, I just talked about the fact that there was, physical evidence allegedly found at the scene of the crime. So the prosecution is charged with the task of proving that that physical evidence was in fact related to or can be at least tied to the actual crime. So I think, the defense is probably going to focus on finding a way to ensure that the defendant is as least associated with that evidence as possible. So to the extent there's any sort of, murder weapon, keeping him as least associated with that murder weapon as possible. Keeping out any key evidence, trying to find issues with chain of custody, things like that, right? There's in these types of cases, you can have battle of experts. Oftentimes the prosecution will bring someone in to say, look, there were fingerprints at the scene. They match the fingerprints of the defendant. And then, the defense will bring an expert in that will, bring into question just how much of a match those fingerprints are, right? So I think in a case like this, especially with the severity of the charges, you really have to attack this at all angles because this is not a minor charge. So I think for
No.
the defense, it's really going to be about attacking the evidence.
And really for the defense, and I know a lot of people who watch this channel know these cases very well. I mean, the job really is it's raising questions, right? And trying to
Yes.
kind of poke holes in that narrative because at the end of the day, you just have to prove reasonable doubt.
100%. And one thing I just want to point out is with a case like this that's so emotional, the jury I mean, I'd be willing to bet just about anything that the prosecution is going to use motive as a tie, right? That's going to be kind
Mhm.
of the little string that they use to, from the very beginning, start convincing the jury that, hey, maybe we don't need bulletproof physical evidence. Maybe on a human level, motive is enough, right? So they're going to start pointing to this love triangle and saying from the very beginning, like, if we can weave this idea that the love triangle was enough, right, to make this person snap, maybe we can get the jury to start believing just from the beginning that we don't need 100% fingerprint match. So even the reasonable doubt, even though the defense, that's from a legal perspective, that's what you're going for. The jury, this is a jury of peers. This is a jury of people that have been in relationships, maybe have been divorced before, have been certainly broken up with before. And so the prosecution is certainly going to weave in the idea of motive. So that's something to
And
look for as this plays out.
yeah, because I think back to what you were saying earlier, where these type of stories play out, and I mean we cover them regularly, where you have a divorce and someone ends up getting hurt. In this case, a woman was allegedly murdered over a messy divorce. Of course, again, the defendant pleading not guilty. We'll see how that part plays out. But the idea of murder for hire, that always gets a lot of headlines. How common do you see these cases where someone tries to pay somebody off to take someone's life and think that they would actually get away with it?
The murder for hire, I would say, is less common than the more common situation where somebody is so impassioned by what they're experiencing emotionally that they may want to hurt their ex-partner, or the person that their ex-partner is now moved on to emotionally and is now dating. The murder for hire is, I think, the circumstance where makes headlines, right? Like this story. But the murder for hire situation, the murder for hire plot, is interesting because it makes you wonder what the alleged, perpetrator was thinking, right? Did they not do it themselves because they couldn't do it, right? It was too much for them emotionally, or is it because it was so well thought out that they really wanted to get away with it, right? So these are actually also things that I think the prosecution is going to try to use as a way to sell the jury, right? When you have a murder for hire plot, it's easier to sell a jury on the idea that, look, this was heavily premeditated. This isn't something that somebody woke up one day and was so impassioned that they just couldn't take it anymore, and they snapped and they went and committed a murder. This took planning. This took calculating. They had to find somebody. They had to hire somebody. They had to coordinate payment. They had to meet up with the person, right? And so that plays into something that the prosecution can use to really put the nail in the coffin at the time of trial. So not as common, but certainly an interesting sort of concept to follow as this trial develops more.
What do you make of the $10,000 that is allegedly what the payment was? Because, and I've said this before, there's no amount of money that you would put on someone's life that would, just the disclaimer of that. But at the same time, like 10 grand does not seem like a lot of money when it comes to a case like this.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that sort of stood out to me. When I saw the amount, I almost had to read it twice, because I thought, wow, I mean, not that there's ever an amount, right? So I
Sure.
don't want it to come off that way, but it was really surprising to me that this individual allegedly was able to find another person that would accept $10,000 to allegedly go out and take the life of another person. I mean, so it's really sort of shocking, right?
Right.
To even fathom, right? And so another interesting thing that I would love to see how the prosecution will use, as a tone, as an undertone, to say, like, that is how little the defendant valued this other individual's life. Like, not to say it'd be any better if he paid more, but
Sure.
and I'd be curious to know the details of how they're going to be able to track the payment, how it was made, and how they're going to use that to, again, really button up their case against the defendant.
And something that stood out to me too is according to what the prosecution is saying, is the getaway driver, who was one of the two people paid, was the one who gave up the defendant, and saying that he was the one who pulled all the strings. And it just goes to this, as perhaps well thought out that the defendant allegedly might have thought that things were going, that at the end of the day, the person you were paying was the one who apparently gave you up, if what prosecutors say happened really did.
It's really interesting because a lot of times you will find that when people commit crimes, you read about this happening where in the middle of the commission of a crime, maybe the person has a change of heart, right? And so they start thinking, oh my gosh, what am I doing? This is certainly not worth it. Or they sort of snap out of this trance. Maybe the $10,000 seemed like it was worth it at the time, but they're in the middle of this moment, right? And they're starting to realize, oh my gosh, if I get caught, this is my potential consequence. This is not worth it. And this can either happen during the commission of the crime or immediately after. And so a lot of times, you get people who, while they're being interrogated, they're the first ones to sort of buckle under pressure, and they'll tell, the detective or whoever is questioning them, look, if I cooperate, will you cut me a break? And so they figure, look, if I'm going to get caught anyway, I may as well cooperate and see if they will, give me a break. And so that may be what happened here. Maybe the person just had a change of heart, realized, look, I'm probably going to get caught. And so I might as well, save myself from whatever I can. That may be what happened.
I think big picture too, and especially in the line of work that you're in, and we've seen so many cases where maybe it's not murder for hire, but it's divorce, and divorce is a reality of the world that we live in. Custody hearings, like those will always go on, but there's so many cases where people get hurt. And allegedly in this case, Portia Rowland, she loses her life. From what you've seen, I mean, what can be done in these custody cases, these divorce cases, where emotions are running so high, where somebody may feel like they have no other option but to take someone's life or try to orchestrate the death of somebody else? What can be done to protect people who become victims in cases like this?
In my office, we do a lot of domestic violence work. And one of the things that I have learned and that I feel really strongly about is prevention. And I think that what is key is really, really taking it seriously when somebody shows a sign of needing support, right? So as people, as human beings, we're all the same in one way. And it's that it doesn't matter how rich you are, how modest means you may be, how, you may have a PhD, you may have a high school, education. We all feel hurt the same way. We feel happiness the same way. We feel pain the same way. We're all human. And so when people are going through breakups or emotional situations or custody battles, it's important that people support their loved ones when they see them in pain or they see them struggling, because, the pain is real. And I think the issue really becomes a problem when the people around them allow them to sort of suffer alone or suffer, in a dark corner, so to speak, in solitude. And I think that's where things escalate, and it becomes extremely dangerous. The other thing is, I think, ignoring mental health issues. I think ignoring the fact that some people need help with dealing with anger management issues. So I think prevention really is key. And I think as a society, we're not doing enough from a prevention standpoint to help people understand what the root of these domestic violence issues are. I also think that we're not doing enough to support survivors. I think there's just way too much shaming going on. And there's also a lot of, um, there are a lot of considerations that people don't realize exist. There are cultural barriers, social, economical, barriers that people face when coming forward. So, for this gentleman who allegedly really took it to unthinkable lengths, I mean, um, who knows what he was struggling with. Not to say it's at all a justification or an excuse, but it makes you wonder, could this have been prevented if there
Right.
were some focus on prevention? At what point, did he ever reach out to anybody to say, I'm hurting really bad. I need somebody to talk to. I need support, right? So from my perspective, I do think a lot of this can be prevented with the proper interventions in place.
Really well put. I also think of the estranged wife who investigators have spoken with, but to think of what she is going through right now as all of this has taken place. It's a lot to unpack. We'll see how this case continues moving forward. Carla Waymeyer, thank you for taking the time to be with us.
First, thank you for having me.
In many ways, this story is still at its beginning stages. The suspect pleading not guilty. We'll continue to follow it here at Law and Crime. I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.